Good morning. I'm Xavier Richardson, Senior Vice President and Chief Development Officer here at Mary Washington Healthcare. Welcome to our 2021 Juneteenth celebration. In celebration of diverse cultures, we feel it appropriate to celebrate holidays such as Juneteenth, which, by the way, became a federal holiday as of yesterday. We're very fortunate to have with us a renowned expert in African-American studies and Africana studies who actually lives here in our community, Dr. Paula D. Royster. She is the CEO and president of the Center for African-American Genealogical Research. She's also an adjunct faculty member in Humanities and Social Sciences at Purdue University, as well as an adjunct faculty member in interdisciplinary studies and history at the Southern New Hampshire University. She has her PhD in Africana Studies from the Union Institute and University. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to present to you Dr. Paula Royster.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, Xavier. I don't think I could have ever imagined anyone who had a whole day named after him introducing me, so I'm grateful to be amongst the giants. Good morning to you, everyone, wherever you are. Happy Juneteenth. As Xavier mentioned, this is a remarkable day in the history of our nation. We're 156 after the end of the Civil War and the liberation of people of African descent. We are celebrating another Juneteenth, but this time as a national holiday. On the screen in front of you, you'll see the official Juneteenth flag. It was created in 1997 by a man named Ben Haith, but it was revised in 2000 to include the actual date, June 19th, 1865. There's a lot of talk about Juneteenth in our current social and political discourse. People are explaining it correctly, that it is the emergence of June and 19th to come to this new term called Juneteenth. What is not discussed is why June and 19 was merged. The answer is illiteracy. When someone owned you, they also owned your time. They also owned your knowledge. Because it was illegal for enslaved Africans to be educated, they didn't know anything about the year, the month, or the day. So when General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston to read the Emancipation Proclamation, telling them that they were free, the only way they could remember it was by merging June and 19th together to give us Juneteenth. So that's the story behind the term. The flag is representative of the struggle for freedom in the United States. The star in the middle has dual purpose. It represents the Lone Star State of Texas, where Juneteenth was first coined. It also represents the people of African descent all across the country. The outburst around the star signifies the opportunities that lie ahead for these newly freed people. And there's a horizon, there's an arc where the red and the blue meet. That's a looking forward kind of signal. So there are symbols and signs in this flag that represent in the red, white, and blue that the descendants of the enslaved and now the new people who were freed were all American, which is why red, white, and blue was selected. To talk about Juneteenth in the foreground, we have to talk about Juneteenth in the background. Why it is we have a Juneteenth, which necessarily means we have to talk about slavery in the United States. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, he did so with two provisions. One, he said that if you were in the red states or the red squares on your screen, the emancipation that you would be free, it applies to you. If you were in the blue states, where these states did not cede from the Union and were a part of the effort to preserve the Union, if you were enslaved in those states, this proclamation, and he says, which accepted parts are for the present, left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. So if you were enslaved in the blue squares, your status did not change. You were still enslaved. If you were in the red squares and you could make it to the blue squares, then the order required that the Union Army receive you and give you safe haven. If you could make it to the states in the white squares, you were free, full, and unfettered, because those states did not acknowledge the system of enslavement. To cover his proclamation, to cover his hind parts, I shall say, he wrote an open letter in August of 1862 to the New York Tribune. And he said, and I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery." Lincoln did not care one way or the other. His goal was to save the Union, but it was also to save his reputation in the international community, which was giving him all kinds of havoc because he couldn't control the people in the state. So he wrote the letter in August of 1862. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862 for an effective date of January 1st, 1863. Now, this was an executive order, and there's lots of talk today about executive orders, and this was his way of getting around having Congress to put this into law. This was the fastest way he could do it. He did it in part because by 1862, Lincoln was losing the battle against the Confederates. There were Union soldiers, white Union soldiers, who were walking away. They were going AWOL. He didn't have enough people to prosecute this war. At the urging of Frederick Douglass and some other Black elites, Lincoln finally allowed African men, whether they came from a white state or a white square or a blue square or a red square, to join the war effort, but he wouldn't allow them to fight because he thought they didn't have the courage to do so. There were also concerns about having arms in the hands of African men, and retribution was not lost on them, that there could be some retribution. But by 1862, when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he was losing the war, and he needed able-bodied people to join the fight. So if they made it to the Union, they would be included in the 175 regiments that were established to train them for the war effort. But by Lincoln's definition, the war effort did not mean going to battle to fight for freedom. It meant to dig trenches, to wash clothes, to cook food. It was a subservient position. The day finally came, though, when Lincoln had no choice but to include these fighting men in the army that they called the United States Colored Troops. On May 27th, 1863, in Port Hudson, Louisiana, it was the United States Colored Troops who beat the Confederates and regained control of the Mississippi River, which was the turning point of the Civil War. The Mississippi River had been used for the Confederacy to ship supplies, to ship people, to communicate on east and west of the Mississippi on their military strategy. And once the Union took over the Mississippi River, things began to turn around for this war. It's instructive that Lincoln and some of the generals on the Union side did not think that African men would fight for their freedom, that they had the courage to do it. In the bottom of your screen is a picture of what they looked like when they got to the Union line. In the center of your screen is what they looked like in the end. The Battle of Petersburg. Many of you may know about that. It's part of Richmond history. The Battle of Crater. Many of you may know about that. That was a very protracted battle in the Civil War. At the front lines of those battles were the United States colored troops. They were closing in on the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. On April 2nd, in the evening of 1865, Jefferson Davis and company burned the town down. They burned bridges, they burned warehouses and supplies, and then they left, ran to North Carolina to hide. The first people to step foot in the capital of the Confederacy belonged to the 5th, 36th, and 38th Divisions of the United States Colored Troops. They planted the US flag in Newmarket, and then they proceeded to put out the flames. And although Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, next slide, please, the news was not carried throughout the Union. General Gordon Granger arrived 2.5 years later. Galveston, Texas, is an island off the mainland, the closest city being Houston. He arrived on June 19, 1865, accompanied by 2,000 Union soldiers. And from the balcony of the building in the center of your screen, he read the Emancipation Proclamation. During the Great Depression in the 30s, under FDR, one of the programs they developed to get people back to work was the Writers of the Works Projects Administration. And what these people did was they went out and they interviewed people who were formerly enslaved. They did audio, they did transcriptions, and they put this collection together, and it's part of our national memory, our American history. One of the women that was a witness to the day that freedom came, the day that the big break occurred, was a woman named Laura Smalley. And in her own words, she describes what happened and how she learned that she was now free. Now, this recording was taken in 1941. If anybody on this line was born prior to 1941 or shortly after 1941, it's very possible that you lived knew someone who also was a firsthand witness to this historic day.
Mom and them didn't know where to go, you see, after freedom broke. Just like you turn something out, turn us out just like, you turn out cattle. I say.
You remember when the Civil War was being fought?
Well, I can't remember much about it, but I remember this much. Mr. Bethany was gone a long time. And I remember the next morning, we all got up and all of them went to the house to see old master. And I thought old master was dead, but he had been off to the war. But then I didn't know, into the war. I just knew he was gone a long time. All the niggas gathered around to see old master again.
Well, can you remember what happened when they set you free? Do you remember how the old master acted when they...
No, so I can't remember that, can't remember that. But I remember, the time they give him a big dinner, on the 19th.
Is that right?
On the 19th, that's called, they said they give him a big dinner. But now we didn't know. I don't hide the other side of the folks, freedom. We didn't know. They just thought, was just feeding us, Just had a long table. And just had just little everything you want to eat, and drink, And they said that was on the 19th. Well, see, I didn't know what that was for. It wasn't wise like children is now. You anything go up now, a child 6, 7 years old can tell you.
That's right.
Yes. You know, and old master didn't tell you, it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They wait till, I think now they said they wait till 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why you celebrate that day. Colored folks celebrate that day.
When Miss Smalley talked about 6 months later, she was referring to the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Slavery didn't legally end until December of 1865. And the reason it took 6 additional months, specifically in Texas, is because the Southern planters wanted the last bit of crops to be pulled and the next set of crops to be sowed. Juneteenth was celebrated the next year in Galveston, Texas, and rightfully so. And it took some time before local organizations such as the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association to pull about $800 together to buy a 10-acre parcel of land so they could openly celebrate their independence, Juneteenth. Even though the rules of the road had changed and the laws were now on the side of every American, it was not socially or politically acceptable to celebrate independence in front of those who did not want to see it happen in the first place. They couldn't do it in public parks. So they had to buy the space in order to be able to freely celebrate. The first Emancipation Park was in Houston, Houston's 3rd Ward. And of course, they had stables and taverns and dance floors. But in 1916, the city of Houston purchased that park. Other places in Texas, San Antonio, Galveston, they all kind of followed after Houston to purchase these spaces where they could freely celebrate their independence without any kind of recriminations. Some of the things that happened on the programming at Juneteenth, and it just really depends on where you are, how you view it. Some people call it a celebration, and some people call it commemorative. For me, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be and. A celebration and a commemoration. And you'd have musicians who would play. And we look at this photo of these musicians and the instruments that they have. This is a very early picture of Juneteenth. And when I look at this photo, and it's probably just based on my level of expertise, I'm wondering, how did they acquire the money to buy those instruments? And secondly, if they were illiterate, how did they learn how to play those instruments? In the photo below, it was the Juneteenth celebrations were always preceded by veterans of the Civil War, U.S. colored troop veterans. And the reason why that's important is because those U.S. colored troops later on became Buffalo Soldiers, which are now called Texas Park Rangers, that elite group of police units in the state of Texas. And they went on to guard and protect Yosemite National Park. These gentlemen were responsible for a lot of things, not just preserving the Union. Because I recall somebody said freedom does not come with the signing of a piece of paper. We know this because the U.S. colored troops showed us it doesn't come with just the signing of a piece of paper. There are political discussions that are supposed to happen at Juneteenth. Who is it worth voting for in blocks that best represent our interests? And they also talked about progress. This is where we were. This is where we are now. How do we keep moving the ball forward. Of course, there was food, there was fun, there was entertainment, but there was also a very serious side to Juneteenth because the consequences of living in the America that they grew up in required that they have a plan for the future. Foods, I hope you all have had your lunch. It can be pretty intimidating to see all of this wonderful food on the screen, but there's a theme to Juneteenth food, and the color is red. Red symbolizes the blood that was lost. So strawberry soda or red soda was considered the champagne of Juneteenth. Red velvet cake, watermelon, barbecue sauce, all red foods were important symbols in the Juneteenth festivities. They also introduced what we call soul food. Soul food is foods that are rooted in the ground. It's kind of evolved to mean something else now, but black-eyed peas and greens represented prosperity. So, and this may just be a natural Southern thing, but in my house, growing up and currently on New Year's Day, which happened to be the same day that the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, we always have black-eyed peas and greens. My mother used to carry black-eyed peas in her coin purse because she said it would prevent her from being broke. Well, she wasn't broke, and I guess it worked. Juneteenth initially started out as people pulling their money together, and like Ms. Smalley said, there would be just a long buffet of food. The food was provided. You paid some money, people went out and purchased the food, they prepared the food, and everybody just came to eat. But over time, it became an event where individual families would bring a dish, their special dish. So what would happen during the year is that if you had a special dish that was very expensive to make, you would do a little bit of extra work so you could buy the ingredients so you could bring it to Juneteenth. This is a 1905 picture of Richmond, Virginia. They were on their way to Juneteenth, and note how many people are in the streets, and note how they are dressed. They have on suits, they have on dresses, dress suits, and hats. Everybody's wearing a hat. Juneteenth was an occasion where you had to get dressed up. Next slide, please. You had to get dressed up because as poor people or enslaved people, you didn't have that opportunity. You wore the rags that were given to you. When they showed up at Juneteenth, they decorated their horses and their carriages in carnations. It was a big festive event. And you can kind of view this as parade floats, right? The picture up top is an 1880 photo from Galveston, Texas. Everybody is formally dressed. Ladies all have their hats on. And this is instructive. If you're thinking about the relationship between African-American women and their hats, this is where it comes from. This is where the idea of your Sunday best comes from, especially in the African-American community. One of the things that was required of Juneteenth is that everybody bring their lawn chairs. I didn't want to forget that. Some of the cultural retentions that are hidden in plain view, if you haven't noticed already, I talked about the Buffalo Soldiers. Family reunions come out of Juneteenth. So when Juneteenth was celebrated, everybody kind of stayed local. Of course, it was an annual event held in June. But as more opportunities became available to people, jobs and education, they moved away from home. For a few years, they came back to celebrate Juneteenth. But then school and work schedules conflicted, so they decided, we're going to go back home, but we're going to meet with just the family at a different time. And that's how we got family reunions. And I alluded earlier that the midnight service, the watch night, the watch night was waiting for January 1st, 1863 to happen. Potlucks, where everybody brings their own special dish, emerges from this event. And of course, the Sunday best and Memorial Day. Many people don't know that it was the United States colored troops who reached out to the Confederate veterans and said, hey, look, you guys, we both won and lost the war because poor people fought in this war. And they reached out to them and said, let's let bygones be bygones. And they continued to do this annually until those who felt like the South would rise again commandeered it. And so the U.S. colored troops, the veterans, pulled out of that meeting, but we celebrate it today as Memorial Day. The other side of the end of the Civil War, the beginning of freedom and emancipation and liberation in this country, was identification. After the Civil War was over, the Southern states, the ones that ceded, immediately went into this phase of Black codes, codes that regulated the movement and the presence of African people who were now free through local and state laws. For example, one of the laws were, if you were an African-American man and you were stopped by a deputized whomever, and they asked you for your identification, you needed to have a piece of paper that showed who you were and a piece of paper that showed who your employer was. And sometimes that piece of paper had to include who your previous employer was. Those deputized people are what we call police officers today. And so if you think about being pulled over by a cop, what is he asking you for? Your ID. When you fill out job applications, you are being asked to report who your previous employer was. It goes back to the relationship and the situational relationship of newly freed people in the United States. Black codes also gave us what we now call prison pipelines. It was a convict lease system. So if you didn't have the proper paperwork when you were asked to show your ID, you were tried and convicted and sentenced to 1 or 2 years of hard labor. That hard labor included building pipelines and railways for private entities. You were rented out for a year for about $2. Somebody paid $2 to rent you out for a year to build your pipelines, to build their pipelines, to build their gas lines for profit, which is why there's so much resistance to privatizing prisons. These things are not unrelated. Our current discourse is not unrelated to our past. Finally, after the Civil War was over, Black people were flourishing, and they were flourishing because they had the job skills needed to keep America going. They did the work. So those white people or poor white people or working class white people were not able to get the jobs as blacksmiths. Were not able to get the jobs as tailors and seamstresses because they didn't have any training. So we moved to a new era that required that you have a certificate that says you are qualified to do X, Y, and Z. That had the intended consequences of moving people out of work. Because if it was against the law to read and write, then you couldn't go to school and get your certificate. It created a whole new system and cycle of poverty. These things are not unrelated to our current discussions. Immediately after April 4th, 1865, when Abraham Lincoln went down to Richmond to thank those colored troops whom he thought would never have the courage to fight for their freedom, the Ku Klux Klan was born. What you can also take away from Juneteenth, things that culminated into Juneteenth, is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was the abolition of slavery, yes, except in prison, which is why the prison pipelines were so successful. As long as you went to jail, you became a prisoner and lost all of your rights. This is why we have that today. The 14th Amendment was the due process clause, equal protection under the law. So in our immigration discussions, when we're talking about that, the rights that are given to immigrants to have a hearing in front of a federal judge comes out of the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the right to vote, with a catch. Only men had the right to vote, and only men who owned land had the right to vote. It did not include women. The 14th and the 15th Amendment was the foundational by which the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was laid. Our current social discourse and all of the rights that we're fighting for today, whether you're fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the right to equal pay for equal work, you can go right back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and say thank you to those 650,000 people who died fighting for the right. What can you do? Well, now that we have a national holiday, what can you do to make sure that future generations don't miss the historical narrative, the other side of the story? I learned about Juneteenth when I was a kid growing up in church, because every third Sunday in June, our pastor talked about Juneteenth, because most of the congregation came from these southern states. Talk about Juneteenth. I know the third Sunday in June is generally given to Father's Day. There's a relationship there. Talk about it in your worship services. Keep in mind when you're reading or listening to people talk about the history of the United States, not from the rose-colored lenses, but not the way we would like it to be, but the way it actually was. And remember that for every story that is written, there is a story that is not written. The civic duty that each of us has is the right to vote. That's what the USCT fought for. They fought for the right to vote, to choose their elected representatives who represented their best interests. 650,000 people on both sides of the war died. And the number is probably higher. Exercise that vote, that right to vote. And then support your local organizations that sponsor Juneteenth activities. There is one happening tomorrow at Pratt Park, being sponsored by the Stafford NAACP. Don't forget to bring your own lawn chairs. It's from 12 to 8 and the cost is free. Pratt Park is a beautiful place. It's got covered pavilions. It's got a baseball field, basketball courts. Go out and support these events in your schools, in your communities. Demand that the history books be updated to include this information. Juneteenth has gone on the radar for a lot of people, no matter where you come from, kind of like the Tulsa Massacre. The only way we're going to be able to heal some of the divides that still persist is to have a complete picture, a complete story of who we are and where we came from. It's the only way we're going to determine who we are going to be. One nation, one voice. Next slide, please. And with that, if there's anything that I've missed, this is the time to ask your questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Royster, for the very, very informative presentation. And thank you for all that you do to preserve African-American history and culture. And now we'll have the opportunity for those of you who have been viewing this great presentation to ask some questions. And some have already been submitted. And Jaden Hyde is with us this morning, will facilitate the question and answer session. Jaden.
Sure. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Dr. Royster, for your time, your knowledge, and yourself. There's been some commentary in the chat about our associates saying that there's so many retention connections that they never knew about before. And they're just very thankful for you taking the time to educate us on these topics so that we can be proponents for change. So one of the first questions we have is actually about that concept of change and progress. So you're an ingrained member of the community, both of you are, of the Fredericksburg community, and you've been involved in a lot of the work that's happened in the area. There's a question about what shift you've seen or felt in the past year as it relates to dismantling racism. Certainly the work is not done. We know that, but curious about any feelings of progress made.
So I do see a dramatic shift. I do. And I see it in two ways. Young people of all races are getting actively involved in the fight for equity and justice, equity and equality. The second shift is coming from what the opponents of the abolition of slavery feared, and that was that there would be interracial marriages. So as interracial marriages are producing biracial children, more people are paying attention to the inequality. So on the one hand, the barriers that used to prevent interracial marriages are long removed, but then children are growing up in societies or going to school where you've got people coming from India, you've got people coming from South Africa, you've got people coming from Japan. So the presupposed descriptors of people who are not American, kids aren't listening to that. They're not buying it. They're rejecting it. And those are the people that we're seeing out in the streets. They don't want to live like the past. They want something better. So I do see a shift in that direction, and I suspect it will not go back. It just won't.
Thank you for that.
I would certainly concur with all that you said, and as one who was born and raised here, I have an even greater appreciation for the change that I see. And a lot of it has been driven by familiarity, which comes with greater engagement. In other words, when people come to know others because they've been forced to in the workplace and in schools and all, there's a greater appreciation and recognition that the differences are far less than the similarities in groups. And I think that there's a greater appreciation for diversity and inclusion. And I thought I would never come back to Fredericksburg, but the way things are going, I am so glad I'm here, and I'm so glad to see the changes.
That's great. Thank you both for sharing. As you both mentioned, this week is historic. With the majority of support from Congress, President Biden signed into legislation that Juneteenth is a federal holiday. Remarking on this occasion, Senator Warnock had mentioned a quote, and I want to state this verbatim. He said, "I would hope that we would not cash in substantive change for an opportunity to commemorate. I think commemoration ought to drive change and not be a substitute for change." So I'm just curious of your thoughts on Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday. And to take that one step further, on your thoughts of the desire of Senator Warnock and other lawmakers to ensure that marking Juneteenth as a federal holiday does not substitute for further progress and change.
Sure, I think you saw that happen with the last one, with Martin Luther King Day. And people opting to do a day of service so that it wasn't just a day off. Clearly, the events of the last 4 years have caused us to reassess and reevaluate where we are. So, and while this is a new subject for many in America, for some of us, the issues have always been there. And hopefully, we can get to the point where, so let me back up. Juneteenth was not discussed outside of Texas because nobody wanted to talk about the conditions that gave us Juneteenth, which was the enslavement of African people and the deprivation of equal rights, education, protections, et cetera, et cetera. So to engage in the concept of Juneteenth necessarily requires that you deal with these very pressing issues, whether it's equity in healthcare systems, whether it's equity in boardrooms or equity on college campuses, in professorships, et cetera, et cetera. These issues will have to be addressed. And I think Juneteenth will expand or give opportunities for others to appreciate and empathize with the progress that has been made by still acknowledging what needs to happen going forward. So I agree, it cannot be, should not be confused with a substitute for meaningful, substantive progress, specifically for people of African descent.
And I would certainly concur with that. And just like you said, with Dr. Martin Luther King holiday, we always encourage people to remember it was not so much a day off, but a day on a day on which you celebrate the legacy of Dr. King and do something substantial or unique in terms of providing service to others. And certainly I hope that Juneteenth will be some celebration, but also more importantly, the commemoration of what others have gone through to make those significant contributions that they've made in spite of the injustices that they've faced, and to ensure that freedom and equality and equity is something that every citizen here enjoys. And that was the purpose of why many of those colored troops fought. So thank you.
Thank you both for that. We have about a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question from our chat, and then we will close out our session today. There is a question: if there was one thing that you would recommend to our organization, Mary Washington Healthcare is a foundation in the Fredericksburg community. Is there anything that you would recommend to us to include in our culture, in our mission, to incorporate exclusiveness or inclusion and diversity to just make a more meaningful impact?
Well, I don't know what to say because I'm not I'm not privy to what it is you do or do not do as an organization. But I do think that you can find ways to meet other people who are different than you. You could do lunches, pair people up and buddy people up and do lunches that way, or have programming where people can ask questions of experts. How do we do this? How do we do that? I think you also, so there's some talking, but there's also some doing that has to occur. One of the things that was one of the initiatives of the civil rights movement was healthcare equity. If there's something going on in the organization that addresses the disparity in healthcare access to it or treatment, and then that may be one of the things that you could do. You could also support, like I mentioned, activities related to voting. The voting matters. But as an organization, you'll have to decide that. And I can't say because I don't really know what exactly it is you do, but I'm sure Xavier can expand on that.
And actually, you've mentioned some of the things that we have already begun to do in our efforts to create an organization that recognizes diversity and inclusion and equity. One thing that I think that we can all do is support our efforts to address inequities in healthcare. And inequities in healthcare go beyond what we do. Many of us are focused on social determinants of health, which really means that the factors that contribute to the well-being of an individual or the health status of a group of people, 80% of that occurs outside of the hospital and healthcare settings. So we have to broaden our definition of what healthcare really means and what are some of those determinants of those inequities. And sometimes it's education, it's housing, it's transportation, so other social conditions. And we have to broaden our definition in terms of what we as an organization will support. And we're doing that through some of our initiatives and our support of Unite Virginia, which is something that we'll be unveiling, which we'll be able to do with some of our community partners. We recognize that what we're doing relative to addressing inequities in healthcare supports our mission to improve the health status of all people in our communities and all the communities that we serve. So we're well on our way. And I thank Jaden for her work in supporting this, and all the others throughout this organization who are doing things. And we're going to have many more opportunities for others to support us. Again, we thank you, Dr. Royster, for being here and providing such an informative presentation. I thank all of those who have been behind the scenes helping this, and my colleague, Kathy Wall, who unfortunately is not able to be here with us today because of some family responsibilities. And we hope that you will partake of the celebration that's occurring in our cafeterias and other places throughout the organizations, and enjoy some red velvet cake, cupcakes and some red punch. You know, I'm watching carbs, so I'm maybe going to take a bite of one of those red cupcakes, and also find it upon yourself to continue to learn. And there was a logo that we used of one of the organizations I was in the theater group growing up. It said, if you don't know, learn. If you know, teach. Today you have learned, so now go out and teach. Teach the importance of celebrating Juneteenth, but more importantly, teach others about why it is so important for all of us to promote health and equities, because we are our brother's keepers. And what happens to others in our community, even to those who may consider it to be the least of us, you need to make sure that you understand it has an impact on all of us. So again, thank you for joining us for this celebration, and happy Juneteenth weekend. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.